You are fluent in Latin. After a car accident, you find yourself in a fantasy world. In this world, humans have been slaves to other species, all of whom use magic. Humans have the capability to use magic, but only by learning the elves' language. After hearing it, you find that it is Latin. It was morning again, or at least my body clock told me it was. So did the angry woman Tora. If the elven voice from the night before was to be believed, she was standing over me and tapping her foot. As soon as she saw my eyes open, she turned and left the room. She had kept her word about not showing me again, but I couldn't help but wonder if she would get in trouble if I didn't appear for meals or our assigned job duties. By the time it stood and pulled on my fresh set of robes, she was long gone from my sight. I could vaguely hear steps in the distance, but I couldn't tell if they belonged to her or not. Thank goodness it'd taken time to memorize my way between my room and the mess hall the night before. In my groggy state, I only made one wrong turn and realized quickly enough. Just like the day before, we were served eggs and our strange orange gruel still tasteless. It at least kept my stomach from rumbling. This time I wasn't the last to finish, and I quickly washed my bowl and left the crowded room. Tora didn't seem to be following me, so I wondered if she had other duties beyond those that Shed taught me yesterday. Not that it mattered, I had learned what I needed to and knew I'd have no difficulty with the tasks. Honestly, the hardest part was remembering to bow to the damned elves, plus without her I would be alone with the tomes and scrolls. Hopefully I could tuck myself away with a few and try to find out how to get my voice back. The thought of my voice brought up thoughts of Yona. For such an angry elf who seemed to want me dead, she sure was attractive. It always liked the feisty women. If you can't get into a fight with someone over semantics, then make up afterwards. Was it even a relationship anyway? I thought I might have a chance of convincing her to give me my voice back. If she had wanted it to be permanent, she would have let Ortho cut out my tongue, and she hadn't. That was always a good sign. My trip to the archive was nowhere near as quick as the trip from my room to the mess hall. I hadn't had time to memorize the path yet, and as I worked my way lower I made several wrong turns, a few dead ends and a smack across the back of my head later, and I was finally at the archive. Within moments of stepping into the stacks I had my own little guide light. I bit my lip and looked up at the towering shelves. Did I get right to work trying to find a magical cure for my voicelessness, or do I go get my day's work done as quickly as possible, then look? My instinct said to start looking for a cure right away. That made me turn and head straight for the returns desk. In this fucked up world I couldn't trust my instincts at all. Look at where they'd gotten me so far. Dead, transported, set a magical study on fire, and then voiceless. So if they said look for the cure, I was sure as hell going to do anything but. So far I'd only seen a handful of elves in the archives, the two who'd stood to greet me. Then it heard at least one more in the study the night before, and there was an old woman and a young man I didn't recognize currently pursuing the stacks. I wondered if access to the archive was limited from those outside, or if elves simply didn't need to visit often, other than Ortho, who very clearly hadn't been welcomed. I hadn't seen any non-elves in the archive. Looking over the returns I quickly sorted them by colored category, and then before starting to take them to their homes I leafed through the lot. It didn't take long for me to realize that dominant red books were histories, dominant blue was magic, and dominant yellow was what passed as fiction around here. I worked my way through putting away the reds and yellows before taking my time to place the blues. I pulled a few off the shelves as I went as well. If my hunch was right, blue purples would be magical history, blue greens would be spellcraft, and indigo would be spell tomes. Tucking my haul close to my chest I sighed soundlessly at my lack of pockets. The elves very clearly did not want us to walk away with any of the tomes or scrolls. Looking to my left then my right I tried to spy the old elven woman and her young companion, but the archive was silent and I didn't see any light bouncing around from their path either. Well, if I can't see them they can't see me, right? I mentally shrugged before turning and looking for a place to read. My armful I cursed at my own light as every little nook I found lit up like the summer sun was out above it. It seemed to radiate outwards as if beckoning the elves to come find me. If my stomach was right, it was lunchtime about now. I definitely didn't want Tora to come looking for me, but I wasn't going to get another time to read. With a shake of my head as if mentally telling myself no, I sat in a back corner of the massive hall and started reading. I don't know how long I read, but my eyes burned and even my faithful little light seemed dim when I looked up at the sound of someone's quick feet on the stone floor. It sounded like they were running. Running to hide or running to find? That was the question, wasn't it? I hadn't had any real success with my reading other than learning that depending on the power level of the user, intent of the magic was clarified with the length of the spell. Someone very powerful, one word could be deadly by mistake. I thought of my use of fire and Ortho's use of open. Mine had lit a literal inferno while his had barely opened a door, and Yona had used long complicated sentences clarifying and further clarifying what Shed wanted her magic to do. Brows pinched I gathered up the scrolls and stood walking calmly to the blue section. If there was one thing my father had taught me it was act like you belong. If you act squirrely people are going to question you. I was simply doing my job, returning scrolls to where they belonged on the shelf. There was no need for them to look at me twice if they noticed me at all. It was the young elf from this morning who had accompanied the elderly elven woman. The teen, who in all honesty was probably older than me, was alone and had their brows pinched in a look of frustration. I couldn't determine if it was a boy or a girl as the not yet mature looked nearly identical in face and body shape. Down one blue row, then up the one I was currently occupying, then down a third. They paused, then paced back and forth on the opposite side of the shelf I was currently facing. I couldn't see them from here, but I could hear muttered curses and the sound of fingers rifling through pages. If memory served me right, that was the section on how to best perform spell work. Intonation, word choice and syntax were all critical to getting the results you wanted. Then as quickly as the teen had come they were leaving again, this time with 2 tomes and a scroll. My curiosity dug at me and I wanted to know what was so important that the elf had needed to run in here and then right back out. Perhaps when they returned the items tomorrow or the next day I would get a chance to find out. My stomach grumbled then and I shrugged. Either I would find out or I wouldn't. It wasn't like I was exactly short on time here. Thinking of time I looked around for any indicator of just how long I'd been tucked away reading. The worst part of these strange above-ground caves was that there were no windows and as far as it determined nothing inside to keep time with. Not even the candles that were used in other buildings were used here. The paper rolls and books far too flammable. I finished returning my reading materials to the shelves, then headed to the mess hall. I'd either be able to eat or I wouldn't. Whether I was too early or too late wouldn't matter. Enough days in this place and my body clock would eventually adjust. It just might mean a few missed meals in the meantime. To my surprise, it was actually just into the evening meal when I arrived. I got a few angry glares, mostly from Tora and the cook, but was quickly handed a bowl and a mug. A tentative sip revealed the drink was some sort of spiced tea, one of the most pleasant things I'd consumed since it arrived. The food in the bowl looked like some sort of goopy stew, but much like the rest of the food we slaves were fed, it was nearly tasteless. I ate it down quickly but savored my tea. I finished eating long before the others, who were quietly chatting about their day, the duties they still had, and what to expect tomorrow to entail. No one even looked at me. Not much conversation to be had with a mute after all, and when they finished eating, got up, washed their bowls and mugs, then left. I was left sitting still, sipping on my tea, unwilling to let the taste go. Cook barked a sharp order at me to clean up my mess before I left, then turned and left the room, leaving me alone in the now dim room. Only the light from the single remaining glowing ball and the embers of the day's cooking fire remained. I leaned my head back against the rough wall behind me and closed my eyes. My hands were wrapped around the now cool mug and I let out a silent sigh. I was unhappy with my life since dying. The ironic thought made me chuckle. Another sip of my tea and I frowned. Working in a library should be my dream job, but the fact that I am a slave to a race of elves who speak freaking Latin just gets my goat. I click my tongue, satisfied with the sharp clack it elicits, the first intentional noise I've made since losing my voice. I spent the next few minutes seeing what sounds I could still produce. Even though the magic kept me silent, I could clack my teeth together, click my tongue and even whistle, but any sound that should originate in my throat or chest was stifled. As always, thoughts of my voicelessness brought on thoughts of Yona the damned elf. If I ever saw her again, I'd shake her until she returned my voice. Not that I thought shaking her would entice her into returning it, but still my hands tightened around my mug in anger and I threw back the rest of my tea, about to get up and finally wash my dishes. Right as I set my mug down on the table and prepared to push myself to standing, I heard voices in the hall. Surely not Tennel, I thought. Yud said Yud sent notice to Elter about the human, said one of the two elves who'd first overseen my arrival. I did, Finnan, and they just said that Assessor Yona had the final say in all assignments. Tennel replied. From his voice I could tell he was the one who'd first told me to stand and then shown me to my room. Finnan grumbled a few nonsensical words, then said, we're really stuck with him then, I suppose. Well, keep him on returns duty, out of sight out of mind, you know. I rolled my eyes. Fucking elves, at least I now knew their names. Tannel and Finnan, Yona and them were on my shit list. I suppose all the elves were, as was Ortho, but those three were at the top. I waited for noises of them to fade from my hearing before I finally stood and washed, then put away my bowl and mug. If my internal clock was right, it was late into the night and I would need to be up early again tomorrow. Who knew if Toro would continue to wake me up?